everyone, I'm Captain Logan, and welcome back to You Made Me Watch. Today I'm going to tackle Samurai Jack, the pilot movie, the first, I think, 3 episodes, all put together as one film. This is requested by Neil McCalman, who usually gives me kind of weird, off-the-beaten-path, often kind of horror stuff, and it makes a lot of sense that this would resonate with his sensibilities, but I think this is probably the most, or at least one of the most mainstream things that Neil has requested, and a thing that he, in fact, assumed that I had seen already, and asked if Eric and I would cover the last season of the show, which came out, I think, a couple of years ago now. It's relatively recently, but years and years after this show was canceled or finished or whatever, they came back with one more season that was kind of geared more toward adults, I think, and was a little bit more violent than the show was allowed to go, but that finally wrapped up all of the story threads. This is just what I've been told. I didn't know very much at all about this show, besides what I had seen from commercials when this was on when I was in junior high school. And so finally I'm taking a look at this. I told Neil I had not watched any of this show before, and that became probably as a shock because I really like Genndy Tartakovsky. I watched a ton of Cartoon Network when I was a kid. I was a big fan of Dexter's Laboratory. I love Powerpuff Girls, which he worked on some, of course, with Craig McCracken, and this very much has a lot of course, those sensibilities, and it's, you know, straight up Genndy Tartakovsky using all of the devices and visual tropes and motifs and things, and that style of storyboarding that he would do in a farcical comedy for something that is more of an action-adventure spectacle, certainly with those kind of quirky sensibilities, but not a straight-up comedy. This is not a laugh-a-minute kind of thing, and it uses some of that really slow pacing with some of the comedic gags in order to create sometimes comedy, but more often dramatic beats, which is really interesting comparing this to those things. But anyway, so kind of odd that I never got around to looking at this, and I mentioned that to Neil, and he was like, well, go ahead and just watch those first 3 episodes that kind of make up the pilot. So Dexter's Lab was a show that would call back to other episodes and do follow-ups and things, but didn't really have a full-on continuity. Like, you'd get to the end of an episode and it would look like a thing that was impossible to come back from. Like, the whole world is taken over by aliens or something, or, you know, the house explodes, or whatever it is, and then the next episode everything would be reset and it would be fine. So it had like a real kind of loose continuity. And then Powerpuff Girls had much more of an actual ongoing continuity, but it didn't have story threads. And this is a much more traditional kind of archy drama, in that it opens with a setup premiere pilot and then continues telling its story. And I don't know how episodic this is after this, but I assume much archier than those kinds of shows. So kind of interesting to see the evolution of that. This is as spectacular as people always told me it was. I was absolutely riveted, and I marveled at this all the way through. Really want to start finally watching the show and going through it. I am more than 15 years late to this party, and I feel really remiss in having not actually finally sat down and watching this. So I'm sure a lot of the comments are going to be like, God, what's wrong with you, Cap? How did you not watch Samurai Jack? Like I said, I think I saw maybe like a scene or two, like little bits and pieces when it was on. I saw commercials for it quite a bit, and this was kind of past my Cartoon Network heyday is the thing. So I was still watching Powerpuff Girls, but a lot of the other programming that was going on then, like I never really got into Courage the Cowardly Dog and Billy and Mandy and things like that. So we were still kind of in first generation Cartoon Network, but it was we were starting to get into a new phase of it, and I didn't like completely dislike any of the stuff that I happened to sample. It's just I was in a place in my life where I wasn't watching a lot of cartoons then, so I just missed the boat on a lot of this. So anyway, it was always a thing that kind of intrigued me. I'm kind of glad that I actually waited to look at this until after I read Ronin, because Frank Miller's Ronin, which Eric and I just reviewed a couple of omnibuy ago, and this is of course, not a straight-up adaptation of that, but very much influenced by it, and this is kind of like what if Frank Miller's Ronin really was a samurai from the past who was brought to the far-flung future, because in that, it's a guy who thinks that he's a samurai, but it turns out that his past is memories that are implanted, and it's not actually what really happened to him. I think it's memories of maybe a person who really lived. I don't remember now, but again, this is not a straight-up adaptation of that. But that premise of a samurai from the past that's thrown into the future and has to deal with the culture shock of it, and it is still kind of living by his honor code, and kind of the fun amalgamation of a couple of time periods is what this is all about, and kind of the anachronisms of this guy from the past having to deal with the crazy culture of the future, and you as the viewer getting a couple of different tones, a couple of flavors all at the same time. And it's kind of interesting, now that I'm thinking about it, to take a character from ancient times and throw him into a future that is for us, a world that is for us even more alien than that is, and it makes the world that he inhabited feel much more familiar and at home for us. So Jack ends up being our eyes in, even though his world is not the world that we live in. So it's familiar in that we might have read things about the time that he lived in and samurais, but we haven't lived it. We don't know what exactly that was like, and then when you put him in this bizarre future, he ends up playing the eyes in. It's a really cool kind of alternate history thing where Jack is, and his name actually isn't Jack initially. When he goes into the future, he fights off some big machines in a really spectacular action sequence, and then there's these guys on the side of the street that are really impressed with him and go on and on about how great the fight was, and they kind of reenact the fight for him using this language that he can't begin to understand, almost as if they're not speaking English. And I don't really know why they would even speak the same language in the first place, but there's a real heightened kind of cartoon internal logic to this. So not as cartoony, again, as some of the cartoons I mentioned earlier, but still, it doesn't take itself so seriously. It's not so realistic that it feels the need to explain things like, why is the main character who doesn't come from an English-speaking country speak English? Although, I guess you could, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, I guess you can kind of make up something, but I don't think we're thinking about it, and I don't think it wants to be that realistic. But when I say you can make up something, we see him train all over the world, so he might speak lots of languages, and he just doesn't fully understand what those guys are saying because they have this really weird vernacular from being in the future, and it gives you a little bit of that commentary that we often do when we go into the future of evolution or degeneration, however you want to look at it, of language. So anyway, but it's this kind of cool alternate history thing where Aku, the big evil demon king lord bad guy, throws Jack eons into the future, and meanwhile 25 years after that he has taken over the planet, and he has continued to rule all of the planet for centuries, and now that's not enough for him, so now he's going after the resources of other races in space. And so this is a bunch of different genres all mixed together. There's obviously a major fantasy thing going on here with Aku and his magical powers. He's very much a mystical creature, and this watches a lot, and it's very much a science fiction thing at the same time. This watches a lot like a fable or an ancient myth mixed in with cyberpunk and other kind of science fiction motifs, and so it watches kind of a modern myth but mixed with a real traditional myth. And I should also mention that tonally it's a thing that, and this makes me very interested to finally see season 5 down the road, because it watches like a thing that wants to be a traditional hyper-violent samurai movie. Like it wants to go all the way, and it can't. It's constrained by being on broadcast television, being on Cartoon Network, and being aimed primarily at children. And so it walks that line as best it can, and I kind of like that limitation. I like the really creative ways that Tartakovsky has to find in order to give us that kind of bloody imagery and stuff without getting completely bloody. So, like, Jack can't just straight up behead or dismember people. And being a samurai, I get the sense that this is not a guy who is, above killing people when he deems it necessary. But of course, we don't see him straight up kill human beings because of the, kind of show it is in the audience it's aimed at. So he will, like, at one point, he, in a bar, he slices off a guy's arm, but it happens to be a cybernetic arm. I doubt very seriously if Jack knew that when he did that, or would have any idea what cybernetics are. He didn't know that. But the show has to do that in order to get away with giving you that image. And then at the end, in a very Frank Miller moment, we've got Samurai Jack, I mean, he's not like he goes around calling himself Samurai Jack, although Aku says that at the end, kind of making fun of him, but kind of almost as a pejorative. But at the end, Jack it fights this really long fight, which remains really engaging and spectacular all the way through, where he fights these big bug things, these mechanical bug minions that Aku sends after him. Some of the coolest storyboarding I've seen from Tartakovsky. I'm so excited to delve into the show. And at the end of it, he's sliced one all the way through, and it gets his, I think, oil all over Jack, and he's like dripping blood, and then he's got this really iconic image, moment at the end where he's holding a flag and he's taken out this bug thing. And then and this is where a lot of the comedy from this show comes from. You'll have this really dramatic, iconic moment that is undercut by one of the dog guys walking in and talking to him, and kind of ruins the moment for him. But he refuses to let the moment be ruined, and I love stuff like that. I think it's really funny. The evolution of dogs as like anthropomorphized humans, but that just look like dogs that are trying to figure out what their heritage is by becoming archaeologists, I think is absolutely hysterical. And it's like half an hour in before there's anything in particular that I would call like ultra absurd, besides just inherently the big evil demon creature with Aku, which is only absurd in the sense that it's not a real thing that would happen. It's a fantasy creature. But we get into the real cartoony absurd stuff more when we get into the future. And I don't think it's jarring or anything. I think it completely works. It helps, of course, that I'm already familiar with, again, some of the animation devices in this, and things are, again, used for drama that I'm used to seeing used for comedy. So it's no shock to me when some of that stuff finally is used also for comedy. One of my favorite things that Tartakovsky loves to do is the really slow, the really slow moving character that we keep zooming in on as it does a thing, and then we punctuate that with a sound effect of just a violin, and this does that in at least one place, and it's like again, not even laugh out loud hysterical. It's just a thing that this animation style does, and so he uses it in another context. And I think it's Jack in the bar dealing with the dog guys, and yeah, that's what it is. And it's this kind of moment of like it's funny, but it's not crazy over the top absurd like it would be used for usually in Powerpuff Girls. It's this really amusing, kind of awkward comedy. And I'm not the biggest fan of awkward comedy, but I really like the way Tartakovsky does it, where they just don't know what to say to each other, and they have this really awkward moment, and they do that with facial expressions, where it's like, and they just... like Jack starts to smile, but he doesn't really know how to talk to these dogs, and then you cut to one of the dogs like, And it's just really fun to see those ideas used in different ways. It's minimalistic in every aspect of the thing except for the score. So the animation is stripped down, toned down like Powerpuff Girls. I could see a person taking one look at this that's not used to this kind of thing and calling it lazy. It's not lazy, it's stylized. The emphasis is more on the storyboarding and making the action look as cinematic as possible before it's on making the images themselves look super detailed. And that's just where the focus is. And so, you know, if you had like a lot more time to work on this, maybe you could make it also really super detailed. But again, I wouldn't call it lazy, and I think it's again, it's almost an anachronistic thing. Again, like with, you know, mixing a samurai with the future, in that you have what looks like really simple drawings that would take a guy maybe like 5 minutes to draw, with this incredibly epic score that is always driving this thing, and really wonderful, sometimes slow-paced, sometimes fast-paced action that makes me forget that what I'm looking at are really simple pencil drawings, and I can't get enough of that. I've always found that pretty amazing. It's astounding how epic this feels with as simplistic as it actually is. I think it's really cool. It's also really minimalistic in dialogue. This is really, really visually driven, and it's got that kind of Wall-E thing where there's a lot of minutes of no one talking at all. I'll be interested to see if that continues into the series. I believe it does, from what I've been told about this. But we don't hear Jack talk for a really long time, even when he's an adult, and we see him train all over the world, and then we see him, I mean, he talks a little bit when he becomes an adult, but it's not until he goes into the future and he's dealing with the guys on the street that he really says very much at all. And it's whenever we do have dialogue, it tends to be more in either like really comedic scenes, or scenes where like a really dramatic one-liner, you know, in the middle of an action thing or setting up an action thing. And that's where Tartakovsky and these guys live, is this kind of visual storytelling. But yeah, so I loved this a lot, and I'm very excited to finally look at more of it. I gotta get my hands on the rest of it, because it used to be streaming on Hulu. You have to get a special add-on now in order to watch it, which I don't have. There's like a live TV thing, that's the only way you can watch it, and I don't even know what that is. That was new to me, so I had to rent the pilot, and I will try to get my hands on the rest of it at some point and see if I can run through it. I don't know if I'll review more of it, but I definitely want to watch it. So anyway, folks, thanks a lot for watching. Sure appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will be back again with more requests very shortly. I'm Captain Logan, and I'll see you again very soon.